So let's talk about general patterns, and more specifically pattern placement. So patterns can sort of be thought of as having two components. You have the pattern itself and then how the pattern is placed onto your surface. And these two topics are really tied together, but for the purposes of choosing a different techniques, let's just pretend for a second that these are two separate things. And then keep in mind, no one pattern placement method is going to work in all cases. Generally, a material will need to use several different ones together in order to get your final material. So the first placement method we're going to discuss is XYZ space. And so this is when your pattern exists inside of a three-dimensional space. And this is generally the way you place procedurals on objects. And XYZ space can be in world space or object space. So for example, if you rotate your object, then your object space changes, but the world space is locked to the world. Now there's a number of different procedurals in the Max Base package, like noise, smoke, dent, and all these use XYZ space as their default. There's also a plugin called Darktree by DarkSim, and this lets you create procedurals that are connected to XYZ space. There's also a plugin called the Essential Textures from Digimation that use this kind of space. So the advantage is that it's really quick to assign this space to an object. And the big disadvantage is that you're really limited by the types of available procedural patterns. So you can't just take any bitmap and apply it to XYZ space easily. It's something that is generally only used for procedurals. So let's have a look at XYZ space. So there are two kinds of XYZ space. There is the space that your object lives in, which you can see here. And then there is a second kind of XYZ space which your pattern can live in, like for example this noise. So this noise is living in world XYZ space. And one way to think of this is sort of like a pool. So the pool is the XYZ space your object is in, and your object is the swimmer, and then the water inside the pool is the XYZ space that your map is in. So we have here just a simple animation of the teapot moving around, and here is what it looks like rendered. And you can see that the pattern is changing on the outside of the teapot. Now in actual fact, the pattern is not changing. The pattern remains completely stable. What's happening is that your object is moving through the pattern, sort of like your swimmer moves through the water that is inside of the pool. So another way to look at this is, imagine these spheres represent the pink parts of the pattern, and the object represents the purple part of the pattern. So as your object moves through the spheres, and as it intersects with the spheres leave on the object residue. And as it moves around, it leaves different parts of this behind and moves into other parts. And so that's exactly the same thing that's happening over here. So each one of these patterns here is just a shape that exists inside of the XYZ space of your material, and it leaves behind a pattern as the object moves through it. So you can change the transform of the space that the map is in separately from the space that your object is in. And that's what these things are here. Offset lets you move the space, tiling lets you scale the space, and angle lets you rotate the space. So you can see as we animate back and forth here, as the tiling gets smaller, the pattern here gets bigger. And as the tiling gets bigger, the pattern here gets smaller. Now we're not actually changing the size of the pattern. That's down here, and that remains the same all the way through. It doesn't animate. What we're doing is we're animating the size of the space that the pattern exists in, which basically, from a visual perspective, does the same thing. So if we look at our pink sphere example again, what's happening is the spheres are growing and shrinking as the space grows and shrinks. And as the space gets larger, it leaves different patterns on our teapot as it grows, and then as it shrinks again. And so that's the same thing that we're seeing here, which is the rendered result. So we generally don't want our pattern to change as the object moves around the scene, and that's the difference between object XYZ and world XYZ. So world XYZ is centered at the world and doesn't move, whereas object XYZ, its center always follows your object. So as your object animates around, the space moves exactly with it. And so the result is, as your object moves, the space moves equally and the pattern doesn't change on your object. So this trick only works if you're doing very simple transforms, like for example rotating your object or scaling it or moving it. But if you're doing something more complex, like for example here's an animated bend. So if you deform your object, then setting it to local object XYZ is not actually going to solve the problem. And you can see that here. As the object deforms, it's swimming through the noise. And this is something that happens pretty frequently. Somebody will assign a noise to a character and they'll just forget about it, and then all of a sudden you're looking at a render and you see some sort of weird moving artifact on your surface, and somebody will go, you know, what the heck is that? And somebody will remember, oh yeah, I assigned a noise to the object. So the way to fix this is you go to your object and below your deformation, whether it be a bend or a skin modifier or something else, place a UVW mapping modifier, and then set it to XYZ to UVW, and set it to any map channel that isn't being used by your object. Then in your material, change the object XYZ to explicit map channel, and for the map channel, choose whatever map channel you chose over here. And now when it deforms, the pattern follows along with it. So now let's talk about blended box mapping. So if you've ever applied a UVW mapping modifier to an object, you'll see there's something called box mapping. And what this does is this projects from the 6 different directions of a box a bitmap onto whatever surfaces you have it applied to. So the blended box map is similar, but the edges are blended together so you don't see any seams. Now software-wise, this doesn't exist in the Mac Space package. There used to be a plugin that did this called Instant UV, but it got discontinued back in the year 2000. And the Solburn scripts has an ugly hack that sort of mimics this feature. The script is called Blended Box Map Maker, and I'll show you how to use it in the middle, but it would be really nice if this were built into the Mac Space package as a plugin, because as you'll see, what the script has to do to mimic this feature is a little bit ugly. So advantage-wise, it's really easy to assign any bitmap to a whole set of objects using this placement method, and also you're not limited by available procedurals, so you can take any bitmap you want, pretty much, and use it almost like it were a procedural. Now, disadvantage-wise, this technique is really only good for noisy textures. Textures that have a really obvious pattern, like maybe the scales of a lizard or large contrasty dots, it doesn't work well because you can see the pattern fade in and out at the edges. And then one disadvantage of using the script that I mentioned earlier, as well as being a little bit cumbersome, is that it requires that all your objects have their Xforms reset, which you can do by going into the Utilities panel in Max and doing Reset Xforms. So if you don't want your Xforms reset, you can't use this technique. Okay, so here's that script I have for doing something similar to a blended box map. And it's called Blended Box Map Maker. But first, let's do a regular box map just so you can see the difference. So here's my teapot, and I will go add a UVW mapping modifier, and I'll set it to box. And then here's a material. It's just got a plain old diffuse map, and inside of here is a sort of noisy bitmap. So it's being applied to map channel 1, and when we hit render on this, you can see that it really doesn't look good here. You see all this weird artifacting that's happening. And the reason this is happening is because there's a projection coming from here, 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 there, and there. And if you are at a 45-degree angle to the different projections, like, you know, this pixel here will say, okay, well, I'm a little more than 45 degrees, so I'm going to take this projection. And then this pixel over here says, well, I'm a little less than 45 degrees, so I'm going to take the projection from this side, and that's why you end up getting this nasty seam. So the blended box map will get rid of this seam. So here's the script, and it's, as I said, a little clunky, but I'll show you the basics of how it works. First of all, you're going to want to create a map. So you take whatever map you want. In this case, I went ahead and I selected the noisy map that's here. And then use selected minute slot. That's going to take this map and turn its result and put it into this selected slot right here. Then it's also going to create the mapping modifiers, and you can pretty much use all the defaults for this. And feel free to play around with this once you've got the basics down. And make sure that my object is selected. Let me get rid of that mapping. And hit apply. And this warning pops up that reminds me that if my object has any rotation or scale transforms on it, then it won't work properly. So you need to have done a reset xform on your object first. In this case, my object has already got its xforms reset, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to say yes. Okay, so this has done a couple different things. The first thing it did was it applied 3 different mapping modifiers to my object. It applied one from the top, one from the right, and one from the front. And they're all planar, and if you look down here, this one has a map channel of 2, this one has a map channel of 3, and then this one has a map channel of 4. So the other thing it's done is it's created this mix map here in the slot that I selected. And what this is a little collection of maps blended using fall-offs. So the top map here is my bitmap set to map channel 2, so it'll use the top mapping. And then the right one here has mapping channel 3, so it'll use the right mapping. And then the front one is map channel 4, so it'll use the front mapping on my object. And then it uses fall-off maps to blend between these different results. So if we take our material here, and if we replace the diffuse color with this map, and then we hit render, you can see that those nasty edges that were there before are now blended away. And one other little tip. If you go inside of here and go into the fall-offs, right now these are very, very smooth fall-offs that are happening. And sometimes that's not actually what you want. Sometimes it's a little too smooth, and you want something that's a little more hard-edged. Not as hard-edged as a full box map, but something a little more hard-edged than the default. Now if that's the case, you can go in here to your 2 fall-off maps and use the mix curve and just change it a little bit so that the transition is a little bit harsher. And I'll also do it to the second fall-off here. Okay, and now when we render this guy, you can see that the blending happens quicker, but it tends to look a little better on some objects, having a little bit of a quicker blend going on than a very smooth blend. So in my script, I'd love to give access to doing this, but unfortunately this mix curve is not accessible via MaxScript, so I can't affect this to give you that option automatically in the script. So you're going to have to do it manually after the fact. So anyway, it's a little clunky because you have this big map tree that you have to carry around with you, and your object has to have its xforms reset, and you have to have all these mapping modifiers assigned. So it really would be nice if at some point this was all replaced with just a single map modifier, which you can set to blended box map here, maybe with a blend value, and then be done with it. But until that happens, this script will get you all the basics. So next is ambient occlusion. Now many people know ambient occlusion as a lighting effect, but can also be used as a placement method for textures. So this is a map that creates a gradient, and the gradient is based on the amount a particular point sees of the sky, and then use a resulting gradient to mix between materials or maps. So any modern ray tracer can do ambient occlusion, such as Brazil or Mental Ray or V-Ray or any of those. And the advantage of using ambient occlusion is that it's great for placing stuff like rust or dirt into the areas where they would normally occur, because stuff like dirt or rust tends to end up in the areas that don't see a lot of its environment. And then next we're going to discuss something called the curvature placement method, and this technique, unlike the curvature method, deals really well with interpenetrating objects. So the disadvantages of using ambient occlusion is, first of all, it's not terribly easy to control. The controls that you use are not necessarily the most intuitive, although you can get used to it if you play around with it a bunch. Also, this has to be used in conjunction with another placement method. Otherwise, the results aren't very useful. And what that means is that once you have your gradient, you really need to do something more interesting with the gradient, like, for example, distort it with some procedural noise or something like that. Otherwise, the results you get aren't, really useful for that many types of shading. And then it also can be slow to compute. If you're willing to do this, you can bake it out, and baking it out is a pre-process that you can do, which means that it won't have to render the ambient occlusion on the fly. But the problem with baking out ambient occlusion is that in order to do that, you probably will end up having one file per object, and if you have a lot of objects, you now have this huge number of files that you have to drag around. And sometimes having all those extra files isn't worth the slight speed increase you get from not having to compute it on the fly. Okay, so we have here a photograph of a real fire hydrant, and you can see there's a lot of rust on here, but many of the areas that have rust are areas that are occluded from the sky, like, for example, down here, or like this little splotch of rust sitting behind this bolt. And so we can use the ambient occlusion technique to get this stuff automatically without having to hand paint it into place. So to start off, we have our two objects. We have a plane, and we have a teapot. And this is going to be our paint material, and then this is going to be our rust material. And then this is the ambient occlusion pass. And we're going to use this to mix between the two previous materials. And this is what the result looks like. So this is a good start. Areas that are occluded are showing rust, areas that are not occluded are showing the paint, but this hard edge line here just doesn't work. This needs to be noised up so it's not as CG perfect. So the first thing that I'm going to try is taking some fractal noise and mixing it in with the ambient occlusion pass. And here's the result. So when we use this as a mix, this is the result we get. Now this is getting better, but overall this is, kind of blurry, not very well defined, and we want some harder edged rust happening under here. So the first thing I'm going to try is clamping the ambient occlusion, and that does a better job, but it's still sort of, you can see this line, it's too evident. So next we're going to try clamping the noise. And so this is, again, getting better, but you can still see how the noise is cut off in these areas of the ambient occlusion. So there was a big discussion about this on CG Talk, and one of its members, Master Zap, said, well, how about instead of clamping the noise and then clamping the ambient occlusion and mixing them together, how about you take the noise and the ambient occlusion, mix them together, and then clamp the result of that? So that's exactly what we're going to do. So here's the noise, here's the ambient occlusion, and then it's mixed together, and then we enable the color map and we clamp the result of this, so there's a lot of black and a lot of white and almost no gray in between. And here's the result. And this is looking much more like what we wanted. And then that's the map which is being used to blend between the rust and the paint. So we have rust appearing in the occluded areas, we have paint in all the other areas, and we have a really nice noisy edge to this, so it doesn't look too perfect. So let's talk about a curvature pattern. So this is a map that creates a gradient, and the gradient depends on the concavity or convexity of a surface, and then you use a resulting gradient to mix between different materials or different maps. So this is sort of similar to an ambient occlusion map, but it captures slightly different information than an ambient occlusion, and I'll speak about that more in a minute. Software-wise, there's nothing in the Max Base package to do this. There are some plugins that do something similar, like F-Edge, the Tension Modifier, or QuickDirt. The place most people have seen a curvature shader, which is similar to a curvature pattern, except it happens at the material level, is ZBrush. For a while it was really trendy to get this copper material that was sort of the yellowy copper on the flat areas, and then in all your little your divots and your creases and wrinkles it would put this sort of green patina material. And so that's an example of a curvature shader. And I do have this sort of hacky vertex paint technique that does something similar to a curvature pattern, except you bake it out into a vertex map. So it's not something that happens at render time. It's something you have to pre-bake. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, advantage-wise, real curvature map is faster to calculate than ambient occlusion. It also captures the convex areas that ambient occlusion doesn't. So ambient occlusion will capture stuff that's concave, but it won't capture any of the stuff that's convex. So stuff that's pointing out won't be captured, and stuff that's pointing in will be captured, whereas the curvature shader will get both. But it does have some disadvantages. First of all, even though it gets the edges and the concave areas, it doesn't deal with object interpenetration, which is something that ambient occlusion does get. In some ways, if you could get both the stuff that curvature grabs and the stuff that ambient occlusion gets and mixes them together, you'd really get all of the various areas you may want to apply different materials to. So the other disadvantage is that it has to be used in conjunction with another placement method. So, you know, you may need to use XYZ space for some procedural, and then this pattern specifies whether the procedural appears or disappears at the edges or on the flat surfaces of your object. So another placement method is called the reference object method. And we're not going to go into any specific examples of this on this DVD, but I wanted to mention it because it's useful in some situations. So what this is a map that creates a gradient, and areas inside a particular reference object are one color, like black for example, outside is a second color like white, and then there are controls for a soft transition. And when I say an object, I mean it can be a geometric object, it can be some sort of special widget, or even lighting. And then use the result to mix between materials or maps. So say you had some character that was supposed to turn invisible, and you don't want it to turn instantly in one frame invisible. You want parts of him to be visible and other parts of him to be invisible at the same time. So one way of doing this is you can create animated masks which blend between the two materials, but that might take a while to do. A more faster way of doing it is, imagine you have, say, a sphere, and you animate that sphere moving up your object. And then you make the sphere non-renderable, so it doesn't appear in your final render. However, that sphere defines any area inside the sphere is invisible, any area outside the sphere is visible. And so as it moves up across your character, the character will appear to disappear, and it's really, really easy to animate your object moving, whereas it'd be much more difficult to do it with animating some sort of different sets of bitmaps. So software-wise, this doesn't exist in the Max base package. There is a plugin called Chameleon that does this. I believe it's owned by Digimation, but I don't believe it works with Mental Ray. Now the advantage is that it's really easy to place a specific detail or feature because it's really easy to manipulate an object in 3D space. And then its main disadvantage is the usual caveat that it may not be very interesting, the gradient by itself. You may need to do something with some procedural noise in order to jazz it up and make it look more interesting. And finally, for placement methods for general patterns, we have a switcher. So a switcher is you define a set of values for a property, such as a material or a map, and then assign a different value for each object in your set. So imagine you have like 200 rocks, and you have 4 different colors for these rocks. So what you can do is you can assign a switcher in your material, and then you can assign one material to all your rocks, and then it'll randomly pick on each rock a different one of your 4 rock colors. And this is a way of having only one material, but it looks like a much more complex set of materials because you're choosing different colors or other properties for the different rocks. So software-wise, there's no one plugin in Max that handles all of the different kinds of switchers that you might want. There is one for materials, it's called the subobject material, but there isn't any for maps. There is one in Max 2010, which is coming up, called the multi-map, and that does what a switcher does. However, it only works in Mental Ray. It doesn't work in the standard renderer. And there is a plugin called Multi-ID Map by Grant Adam, which is a free plugin you can get on maxplugins.de, and it's compatible with all the other renderers, like the Scanline renderer and like Brazil. But it doesn't work with Mental Ray, and also you're limited to 15 slots. So if you have more than 15 varieties of something, you can only use at most 15 of them. So the advantages of using this technique is it's really great for adding variety to your scene. And disadvantage-wise, it has to be generally used with another placement method to get something useful. And also, the disadvantage if you're using multi-ID map is that each set of faces can only have a single value instead of multiple values. And so, say you have 5 different rock colors and 5 different rock bumps. If you could somehow have 2 different sets of IDs on your objects, then you could have a total possibility of 25 different materials. Because, for example, you could get the first color with the first bump, or you could have the first color with the second bump, or the second color with the fourth bump. But because the multi-ID map will only recognize one ID per object, you'll always get the first color with the first bump, and the second color with the second bump, and the third color with the third bump. So you get far less diversity for a smaller set of maps. Okay, so let's show some practical examples of a switcher. So say you have a bunch of rocks here, and you want to apply 4 slightly different colors to each of the rocks. So one way you can do that is you can first of all use the Material ID Randomizer script, which is one of the Solburn scripts. Set, let's say we're going to use 4 different colors. So set low to 1 and high to 4, and then hit apply. Oh, sorry, select all the objects first, then hit apply. And you can see that each one of these objects has now a material modifier assigned to it set to a value. So this one has 2, that one also has 2, that one has a value of 4, that one has a value of 3. So it's randomly assigned them to the different rocks. Now what you do is you open up the material editor, and here's our material, so it's only one material. And then under the diffuse color, we apply a multi-ID map. So this is that map written by Grant Adam, and each one of these IDs here matches with the ID that's assigned to one of the rocks. So I can go into the first ID, and I'll choose solid color. This is a simple plugin written by Blur that just applies a single color. So I'll make it sort of rock colored, a little more brown. Then I'll copy it 3 times. Make this one a little brighter. This one a little darker. And this one maybe we'll make sort of a blue-gray. Okay, so now that this is assigned to the rocks, if we do a render, we see that each one of our rocks has one of the different colors assigned to it based on what IDs the rock has. So this is a real good way of applying a bunch of random color variations to a whole lot of objects. And the nice thing about it, it's also flexible. So say the director says, I love this, but I really wish that rock were gray. So you can do that just by selecting your rock and then changing the material ID here to 4, which was our gray color, in here. And now when we render, it's got the gray color that the director wants. So here's another switcher example. Say you have all these rocks, and instead of just a different color, you want to apply a totally separate material to each one of these guys. So I already went into the material editor, and I set up 4 materials, these ones here, and they have different colors and slightly different highlights on them. So there's another script I have, which is called Material Mover, another Solburn script, and what this does is this moves materials from one part of the interface to another. So say we'll set from is medit, which is the material editor, and then we don't want the full range, we only want these 4 materials. So I'll do specific range, set this from slot 2 to slot 5. Then the to field, I want it to put these to the scene objects. And then instead of 1-to-1, I want to do random, so it randomly assigns them. So then if I hit apply, you can see that it is now randomly assigned one of these 4 materials here to the different objects. Now even another way of doing this is using the multi-sub-object material. And this is very similar to the way the multi-ID map works. So we have 4 different slots here. I'll set the number to 4. and each one is filled with one of these materials up here. So now, these rocks still have those material IDs that I assigned from the last example. So if I select all these objects and assign this material, now this material, even though it's one top-level material, has all these submaterials, and these submaterials are being applied to our rocks based off of the material IDs that were assigned to them using the material ID randomizer script. So finally, one more switcher example. Say you have a single object that contains a bunch of sub-objects, like here. And this happens quite frequently, especially if you use the scatter compound object. So you still want to apply different materials to all of your different rocks here. And one way you can do this is you can apply the sub-object material that we had before. And then on top of the object, we put something called the material by element. And what this does is this allows us to assign a random ID to each element inside of our object. So each one of these is given a random ID number, which corresponds then to one of these 4 materials. And this is still flexible like the other version. So let's say the director again wants this to be gray. You can go in here and do an edit poly. Select that rock by element. And then under material IDs, you can set the ID to being 4. And there you go. Now that rock is gray like the director wanted.